Hello and welcome, I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching the World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories of the hour. Russian President Vladimir Putin says Moscow is ready to end the war in Ukraine through peace talks, while claiming Kyiv shows only limited readiness for dialogue. He also asserts Russian forces hold the strategic initiative and are advancing along the front line. EU leaders agreed to borrow money to loan $90 billion to Ukraine for its defence over the next 2 years. They drop, for now, a plan to use frozen Russian assets after divisions within the bloc. Authorities say the suspect in last weekend's mass shooting at Brown University is found dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Investigators say the gunman, identified as a Portuguese national, is also responsible for killing an MIT professor 2 days later. Violent protests erupt in Bangladesh after youth leader Sharif Osman Hadi dies from gunshot wounds sustained in Dhaka last week. Authorities say media buildings are torched and vandalized as the interim government declares a day of mourning and urges calm. The US envoy Steve Witkoff is set to hold talks in Miami with officials from Qatar, Egypt and Turkey on the next phase of the Gaza ceasefire. A White House official says the meetings come as efforts to continue to sustain peace despite reported violations on the ground. Australia will launch a national gun buyback scheme after the mass shooting on Sydney's Bondi Beach last week, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has said. The move echoes tough gun reforms introduced after the 1996 Port Arthur massacre, as tributes are held for the victims of the tragedy. The US military says it carries out kinetic strikes on 2 vessels suspected of drug smuggling in the Eastern Pacific. US Southern Command says 5 suspected narco traffickers are killed and no American forces are injured. China and the United States step up separate efforts to broker a ceasefire between Thailand and Cambodia ahead of regional ministers' meetings. Around 60 people are killed and more than 500,000 have been displaced in the worst fighting in years after a truce brokered by President Donald Trump collapsed. Japan reaffirms its long-standing pledge not to possess nuclear weapons after reports a senior security official raised the idea as a deterrent. The government moves to distance itself from the comments made amid concerns over a worsening regional security environment. Okay, we start this hour in Europe, and Russian President Vladimir Putin warns of severe consequences if the European Union had used frozen Russian assets to finance Ukraine. Speaking at his annual press conference, Putin called such a move a robbery and said the EU avoided it to prevent serious fallout. This comes as EU leaders reached a deal to provide Ukraine with a roughly $115 billion backed by the bloc's common budget. The agreement follows weeks of negotiations after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky urged the EU to use $220 billion of frozen Russian assets, but legal and liability concerns prevented the plan. Zelensky welcomed the loan, calling it a significant amount of support that strengthens Ukraine's resilience. According to the EU leaders, the deal would help Ukraine meet its military and economic needs for the next 2 years. Joining us now is Professor Veselin Popovsky. He is a professor and vice dean at Jindal Global Law School. He joins us live from New Delhi. Thank you very much for joining us here on NewsX World. Before we get to the Putin comments, Professor Popovsky, let's first go back and, of course, that decision this morning to, in fact, loan Ukraine $90 billion, but not go forward with this plan to use those frozen Russian assets. The predominant amount were indeed in Belgium in Euroclear. Has today been a win for Ukraine, or would this has this lack of going through with the usage of frozen Russian assets been a huge setback?
It's a very good news to have the loan, and this is simply a practical step. The big frozen amount needs extra time to be justified in terms of possible reparations for the damage caused by Russia into Ukraine. It will be much bigger than that amount of the frozen assets. But because Ukrainians need money immediately, and mostly because Donald Trump stopped what Joe Biden did back in 2024. Unfortunately, the Donald Trump administration stopped its own help to Ukraine. And for that matter, there is no reason Donald Trump must ask for any thanks from Zelensky. Zelensky should thank Joe Biden for what he did over the last 3 years, not what Donald Trump did over the last year, which is nothing, zero. No penny from United States reach Ukraine, and that's why the Europeans need to step up, and they need to provide the money to Ukraine, including for military purposes.
Yes.
Ukraine now to buy the weapons. You cannot just borrow, it cannot be given for free.
Professor Popovsky, do you think that this is the last time we hear of this plan, or do you think there's room for further negotiations?
If you mean the peace plan...
Apologies, I mean the frozen assets plan.
No, the frozen assets will hear a lot of this. They will stay in the hands of the Europeans, and at some point they will reach Ukraine, but that needs to be properly, legally justified, as I said. Those frozen assets will never go back to Russia, absolutely never, because the damage that Russia produced in Ukraine is much, much bigger than those frozen assets. And these are, by the way, the frozen assets of oligarchs who benefited from the Russian aggression in Crimea 11 years ago, and who benefited from the Russian aggression since February 2022. There is no way this money belongs to Russia. Don't listen what Putin says. These are money that needs to go for the restoration of Ukraine because they are made out of the aggression itself. And that's very clear. We will hear about this many times again because at the end of the day, they will be given to Ukraine.
Okay, Professor Popovsky, do stay with us as we move from Europe over to the Middle East for our next story. And a top Hamas official has said that the talks in Miami will advance the next phase of the Gaza ceasefire, as it must aim to end Israeli truce violations in the Palestinian territory. The Hamas Political Bureau has stated that the people of Palestine expect these talks to result in an agreement to put an end to an ongoing Israeli lawlessness, to halt all violations and compel the occupation to abide by the Sharm el-Sheikh agreement. Meanwhile, the United States is hosting a meeting in which US President Donald Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, is expected to meet senior officials from mediator countries, Qatar, Egypt and Turkey, in Florida to push for the second phase of the Gaza ceasefire deal. We're once again joined by Professor Popovsky. Of course, October the 10th, we saw this ceasefire put into place. However, since then, we've seen violations on both sides. Over 370 Palestinians reported dead, as well as violations from Hamas firing on Israeli troops, resulting in some casualties after this ceasefire. We still see a singular hostage remains left inside the Gaza Strip as well. However, Hamas have said in relation to these talks in Miami today that these must end what the official is calling truce violations. Is this a genuine negotiating position, and what do you expect from the talks today between the Qataris, the Turkish and the Americans?
Yes, there are violations. You're absolutely right, Thomas. You pointed also the other parts of the ceasefire agreement back in October 10. And unfortunately, there were both sides violations. Both the Israeli and the Hamas fighters continue some exchange of, although as limited as it is, it's still a violation of a ceasefire. So the next stage here is really to continue negotiations. Ceasefire is not the end of itself. There need to be longer-term decisions made for Gaza, and not only about the ceasefire itself, but also about the security issues, about the people in Gaza and the humanitarian assistance, the future of the political arrangement, and all of that needs to be negotiated. And obviously, Hamas remains an actor here as far as it has its own control over Gaza, and there needs to be more negotiation as to, first of all, stop those violations of the truce. And I think this is the tactical, again, point here of Hamas, is to basically demand Israel to stop fire in exchange of its own cooperation with the deal, which also means stopping rocketing and shooting Israeli territory. On another hand, we can also see the negotiation as a step for the future, because the big question is what will happen with Hamas, because absolutely nobody will accept Hamas to have any role in the future of the governance in Gaza. And that is, for me, more interesting question, but we still don't know the answer of that. We need to wait and see.
What I want to touch on next is the fact who Witkoff is meeting today. Qatar, who of course mediated both Hamas and Israel for a wide breadth of the conflict. Israel, of course, bombing Doha earlier this year. And we've got Egypt, of course, opening, which has one of the checkpoints on the Gaza Strip. And we've got Turkey. Now, Turkey, of course, led by President Erdogan, a long-time vocal critic of the Israeli government's actions in Gaza, and Benjamin Netanyahu directly. However, they have voiced their urge and their want to be part of this international stabilization force. That is, of course, part of this second phase. How coherent is this mediation effort really with those players at the table today?
Actually, a very good format. I must say I respect all of those diplomats. Qataris, Egyptians, and Turkish diplomats are very experienced. They're very well prepared for this. They play already a big role. It was not United States. It was Qatar and Egypt reaching the ceasefire. Obviously, Donald Trump wants to say he did everything. He did very little. And it was Qatar and Egypt to take all the praise for the successful negotiations with Hamas and Israel at the end of the day. And Turkey, yes, Turkey is an important factor here. In terms of future deal in Gaza, possible presence of Turkish troops in Gaza is one option that is discussed. But generally, my position here is it should be a United Nations umbrella of any presence in the future of Gaza should have the blue helmet, the United Nations global legitimacy. Those could be Turkish, Qatari, Egyptians, Americans, Europeans. Anybody could be under the so-called United Nations peace force in Gaza one day, once it is achieved. So my respect to these negotiations. I hope they deliver. And this is the right format, as I said. All three countries, Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey, have experience and very neutral diplomats. They can play a very good role here.
And what have your thoughts been on how Israel has been acting post this ceasefire deal? Of course, we saw an assassination of a high-profile Hamas figure inside the Gaza Strip. Of course, Hamas said that was a violation. 4 people were killed in the process, with 25 others injured. Israel continues to, of course, occupy further territory in the Gaza Strip. This will, next phase, if it does come into practice, will see Israeli troops pulled back. How likely do you think that Israel is to agree to something like this in the near future, especially, of course, at that key factor that Hamas is yet to agree to disarm, or give any time frame for that?
Yes, I agree. These are very worrying facts, and what Israel doesn't comply with. But Israel did it before that as well. For over the last 2 years, Israel committed many war crimes in Gaza. So again, this is a kind of a minor violation comparing to what Israel already did, killing so many civilians in Gaza over the last 2 years. So again, Israel is not playing very well on this, and they claim that they somehow removed the Hamas leader with a limited precision strike, but that's absolutely legally violation of the truce in itself. They shouldn't do that. So hopefully Israel also realizes that its behavior does not contribute to a long-term peace deal, and stop doing that. That's my only message here, that these are violations. Israel should stop doing those.
Professor Popovsky, as always, it's a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you very much for joining us. We now move over to the Indo-Pacific, and Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Guang Jiakun has said that China's position on the TikTok issue is consistent and clear following the reports that TikTok has signed a joint venture deal with investors to maintain its US operations and avoid a ban. Guo has warned Taiwan by saying that the US approved $11 billion in arms sales to Taipei will increase the risk of conflict between China and the United States, as such moves put the region on what it calls a power keg. Let's take a listen in to what they had to say.
媒体上相关的报道，如果相关消息属实，则事态相当严重，暴露出日方一些人企图突破国际法、拥有核武器的危险图谋。中国和国际社会必须高度警惕，严重关切。所谓驻台应对威胁，只会助长台独嚣张气焰，让台湾老百姓坐在火药桶上，把台海推向危险境地，也势必推高中美冲突对抗的。
We're now joined by Collins Chong-Yu-Keat, Foreign Affairs and Security and Strategy Analyst, joining us from University Malaya in Kuala Lumpur. Thank you very much for joining us here. Let's first start on TikTok. Beijing says its position here is consistent and clear. In real terms, does China actually accept this joint venture that keeps TikTok operating in the United States?
Well, it has to, because we have seen how, it's increasingly being trapped by the move by Trump. And China has publicly framed this deal as a commercial solution that balances interests and respects laws. And this is a signal that Beijing prefers negotiated outcomes as compared to unilateral bans. So, of course, China will still retain the capacity to monitor technology exports, intellectual property elements of the deal. So it means that this conclusion is not a simple commercial transfer. It is also tied to this broader US-China tech and diplomatic negotiations. And this episode reflects how economic and tech issues are now deeply geopolitical, and that every corporate deal has strategic implications. Of course, for the past couple of months now, we have seen how China has, lobbied for efforts for, for Washington not to, completely ban TikTok, and that he is still finding ways to have this mutually beneficial outcome. And this is one of them. And of course, we have seen how, China needed this more, and therefore, although it's now having these minority stakes now, we have seen how, China has been strategic in getting the intended outcomes from this deal. But China will still maintain some, of course, oversight. Of course, the majority control will be on the side of the US, and that still it can be used as a pretext on future, deals as well as future issues, bilaterally.
Collins, of course, yesterday we saw an $11.1 billion arms sale to Taiwan from the United States. How much would have that shaken Beijing after that was announced?
Well, we have seen how China is well aware of the need for Washington to continue to show support, and as a message, as a warning also to Beijing, that despite the red line being set on Taiwan, the U.S. will still continue to maintain the line of support, at least in defense and security terms. And that although this points out also the core hypocrisy of China, of course, warning this risk of conflict over Taiwan's arms sales, but yet still China still conducts near daily military deals over Taiwan. It crosses median lines, uses coercion as a routine policy. So arms sales, they act as defensive stabilizers. They are not triggers. And that, of course, also we have seen how this has been used as another pretext by China to control the narrative not only over Taiwan but also over Japan, and to frame this as yet another maneuver by both the U.S. to cross the red line that has been set by China. But of course, this is yet a strategic move by Washington to send a clear message to Beijing that despite the rhetoric, despite the narrative, you're still bound by law and by norms, that we need to come to the defense over Taiwan, and of course to deter Beijing's future bellicosity over Taiwan and Taiwan Strait.
Collins, stay with us as we move to further updates from East Asia. And deep concern has been expressed by China after reports emerged from Japan. It has been reported that a senior security official suggested nuclear weapons to be acquired. The situation has been described by Beijing as quite serious. Warnings have been issued over a possible violation of international law, and the remarks have been called a dangerous attempt to circumvent international rules by Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guai Jiakun. It has also been stated that nuclear weapons were needed due to a worsening security environment, while political difficulties were acknowledged. Japan's nuclear policy has been reaffirmed as unchanged by Chief Cabinet Secretary Minoru Kihara. The remarks have surfaced amid strained China-Japan relations. Let's take a listen in.
中方十分关注媒体上相关的报道，如果相关消息属实，则事态相当严重，暴露出日方一些人企图突破国际法、拥有核武器的危险图谋。中国和国际社会必须高度警惕，严重关切。现在日方一些势力又放风要拥有核武器，反映出日本右翼保守势力复活军国主义、摆脱国际秩序约束、加速再军事化的野心膨胀。
Collins, Japan insists its nuclear policy is unchanged. So how serious should we take these comments from Beijing?
Well, Beijing knows that Japan is not about to acquire nuclear weapons. What alarms China more is the normalization of nuclear discussion in a country where historically has been defined by nuclear restraint. So we've seen also how this is not about Japan destabilizing the whole region. It is about China discovering the limits of intimidation. So China is reacting strongly, not because Japan is going nuclear, but because Japan is no longer psychologically constrained by all taboos. So the real issue is the China's loss of control, narrative control, not about nuclear weapons. So you have rightly pointed out that China has not changed its policy. It is about China, Japan has not changed its policy. It is about China exposing its own insecurity. So Japan remains firmly committed to its three non-nuclear principles. No policy shift on that, no program, no capability change about its nuclear doctrine, but it is about China's overreaction. And this reveals its own strategic anxiety. It's not about Japan's recklessness. So if this mere discussion causes panic in Beijing, so it shows us that how fragile China's deterrence narrative has become. And of course, also this being used as yet another pretext by China to condemn Japan on the sideline of course, Takaichi's new statement. Yet, China's own actions are what have been destabilizing the whole region for the past years now. Expanded missile deployments, militarization of East China Sea or South China Sea, and increased pressure over Taiwan. So this is a normal response by Japan, and yet this reveals the strategic vulnerability of Beijing's own narrative control now, as we have seen.
Collins Chong-Yu-Keat, thank you very much for joining us here on NewsX World. It's a pleasure to have you on the programme. We now move on, and South Korean gaming giant Krafton has been positioned at the lead of a $666 million investment fund in Asia, with India placed at the centre of its strategy. The fund has been launched in partnership with Naver and Mirai Asset. This move has heightened South Korea's expanding economic footprint in India, where cumulative foreign direct investment has reached nearly $6.8 billion by mid-2025. The fund, named the Unicorn Growth Fund, is set to be managed by Mirae Asset Venture India and is expected to begin operations in January 2026 with an initial corpus of over $333 million. Krafton's presence in India has already been strengthened through investments exceeding $200 million, while its flagship title Battlegrounds Mobile India has crossed 240 million downloads, despite facing temporary bans over data security concerns. But that's all that we have time for. Keep watching NewsX World for more international updates.